we're learning the Sefer Sifsei Chein, which is a overall general hakdama, general introduction to different fundamental concepts within Hasidus. Um, you can't really talk about Hasidus and you can't really understand Hasidus at all without understanding the underlying Kabbalah that lies within and behind Hasidus. The whole point of Hasidus was to take the Kabbalah of the Arizal and bring it down to a practical human level, a relatable level, instead of trying to take the human being and bring the human being up to very, very high, profound spiritual places. The Baal Shem Tov comes along and says we can take those very high spiritual places and appreciate that everything the Arizal is talking about in metaphysical terminology and about olamos and different worlds and different consciousnesses and different aspects of different aspects of the soul and of the neshama and all of these different things that the Arizal talks about, spheros and partsufim and so on. All of these are just ways of talking about and providing us with language to appreciate and relate to the things going on inside of us. So, since the Baal Shem Tov is bringing the Kabbalah Arizal down to a practical level, and all of Hasidus is really taking that idea and expanding on it and focusing on different aspects of it, etc. So, in order to understand Hasidus on more than a surface level, one has to really understand, at least in some sense, where Hasidus is coming from. So this Sefer goes through a lot of those underlying concepts, from the Seder HaShtalkelus, the way in which creation comes into being, and we get from a singular, all-encompassing, all-annihilating, infinite HaKadosh Baruch Hu, down to a reality that we experience down here. What is that process? How does it look? What does this reality consist of? How can we understand the different forces at play within this reality and within ourselves and within the material world? So all of that is covered within this Sefer, as well as many other ideas that are much more abstract than that. But he does it in a very practical and very relatable relatable way, I think. So just by way of introduction, the Sefer itself is structured in a particular way. If you have the PDF of the Sefer or a copy of the Sefer, what you see is that the book is printed in such a way that you have in the middle of the page in larger type, you have the main text of the Sefer, which is very straightforward, very accessible. The Hebrew is relatively easy to read, and the concepts that it talks about them only on a very abstract and very high level of abstraction, meaning a bird's eye view. All right, not getting into the nitty-gritty details too much. And then around that, you have a kind of commentary that is a little bit more detailed, that brings from various books, primarily Hasidic books, books of Hasidus, but also books of other of Kabbalah and other streams of interpretation of the Arizal as well, to expand on and explain these ideas a little bit. And at the bottom, we have there's a running commentary along the bottom called Levias Chein, and that sort of takes particular concepts that are touched on in the main text and tries to expand on them in a big way, and cover the topic in a broader and conceptual sense. So the goal of what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and work through the main text of the Sefer, which is found in the middle of each page. And as appropriate, here and there, we're going to either use what's written on the sides and on the bottom, or actually read through what's written on the sides and on the bottom, to expand on that when it's necessary. But we're not going to go through the whole thing word for word exactly. Okay, so with that, I think it's worthwhile to just jump right in, and we'll go from there, and we'll develop a kind of a cadence and a methodology as we go along. Okay. So he begins. He says, "Kisha'Allah b'Ratzono hapashut yisbarach livro ha'olam, when it arose within the simple, straightforward, uncomplicated will of the Creator to create the world, in order to give over and impart and extend His goodness to His creations. Lo haya shum avir umakom panui livro besocho shum davar. There was no air, there was no space, there was no empty space, there was no air, there was no atmosphere, so to speak. There was nowhere within which creation could exist. There was nowhere for creation to be created. Why? Kikol hametzias hayamumula me'or Hashem me'or Hashem hagadol hanora hanikra Ohr Ein Sof Baruch Hu. Because all of the reality that existed before creation, all of the reality that existed at this point where God decides to create the world, all of reality was entirely and totally filled, encompassed by, and encompassed within itself only this light, this great and awesome light, Hanikra Ohr Ein Sof, which is called the Ohr Ein Sof, the infinite light. Right? So all of reality, at the time when God, so to speak, decides to create the world, and why does He decide to create the world? He decides to create the world in order to give goodness to creation. You can't give goodness to creation without creating anything. So we'll talk about that, exactly why and what's going on over there, why God is giving goodness to creation, or why God decides to create a world in order to give goodness to creation. But when God decides this, it can't happen, so to speak, because there's no space, there's nowhere for it to happen, because everything is filled with the Ohr Ein Sof. Everything is entirely filled with the Ohr Ein Sof. Now, why does that mean that nothing can be created? Because this light, it was so strong, it is so strong, so that it's impossible, so to speak, it's impossible to create to create anything within it. Afilu malachim misrafim, even angels, even different kinds of angels, which are purely spiritual beings. None of these things can exist within the space that is wholly and completely defined as Ohr Ein Sof, as the light or the expression, the manifest, powerful expression of God's presence. Because this light annihilates, burns, and destroys everything in its path. Nothing can exist in the same space as this light. Al-Kain, therefore, therefore, in order to create anything, God, so to speak, had to create an empty space in order to create within that space, within that empty space, so to speak, worlds. Meaning, what He's doing is He's creating the possibility for the existence of other realities. Nikra makom v'chalal panun. And this space is called this is called makom. This is called space, meaning the possibility for other things to exist. The possibility for existence is called space. It's called makom v'chalal panui, and it's also called empty space, the empty void. Okay, so with that was a lot. There's a lot there. So let's just jump back a little bit and talk about whatever it is that just happened. Okay. First, we started off by pointing out that at a certain point, it arose, so to speak, within God's will, God's Ritzono HaPashut, His simple will, right? Ritzono HaPashut means Pashut means both simple in a certain sense, but it also means undifferentiated, ungraspable, too simple to even be understood. There's no differentiation here. There's no definition here. Ritzono HaPashut is what is described in the Gemara in various places as God's basic, the point at which God basically says, you can't understand. What we're talking about here, is the very, very beginning of creation and what prompts creation to come into being. Prior to creation, not only is there God, but there's something else. There's something called the Ohr Ein Sof. Before creation, there is something called the Ohr Ein Sof. The Ohr Ein Sof itself, we have to be careful and emphasize that the Ohr Ein Sof, the infinite light, is not God. Okay? We can't say anything about God itself. The infinite light, the Ohr Ein Sof, is not God. It's the infinite light of God, in the sense that the light itself is already an expression of the essence of divinity. God is all encompassing. So you can't say that the infinite light, even to the extent that we're using these words, is God itself, because God necessarily encompasses both light and darkness, and infinity and finitude. So infinite light is already a particular expression of the totality of God's essence, we can say. Now, why did God choose to express God's self through infinite light, through the Ohr Ein Sof, or as the Ohr Ein Sof? Why is God revealing himself as infinity, as all-encompassing? We have no idea. We're not talking about that. We can't possibly begin to ask or comprehend why it is that we begin creation from the point of Ohr Ein Sof. Why couldn't God have begun in a different way? Why couldn't God's expression have been darkness instead of light, so to speak? Why couldn't it have been taking instead of giving? Right? He says that the Ohr Ein Sof has this desire to give goodness, and we're going to explain that inherent within our conception or our understanding of God is that God is good, and goodness demands the expression of goodness and the imparting of goodness to others. But it doesn't have to be that way, of course, because God is all powerful, and God could have made reality a different way, where the expression of God, of godliness, or the essence of godliness, is not goodness; it's something else. Um, None of this is necessary. It's only at the point after which God has expressed an Ohr Ein Sof with a characteristic of goodness that we can begin having any conversation about what it is that we're talking about here in terms of creation. But prior to that, there's nothing to say and there's nothing to talk about. But it's important to appreciate that there is something prior to this. Um, Before creation, there's Ohr Ein Sof. And before Ohr Ein Sof, there's something else, even bigger than that. And we have no idea what that is, and we don't know why that thing, that essence of God, decides to express itself as Ohr Ein Sof with certain characteristics. We don't know. What we do know is that the expression that God chose to express is Ohr Ein Sof, and the characteristic of Ohr Ein Sof is goodness. And within that system that is determined to be that way for reasons that we don't know, within that system, now we can start having a conversation about the characteristics of God and how things begin to unfold. But it's very, very important to appreciate that none of this is necessary from God's perspective. From our perspective, it seems necessary. From our perspective, it seems necessary that God is goodness, and goodness means that there needs to be creations so that the goodness can express itself and others can experience that goodness, because chok hatov lahetiv, the rule or the postulate of good is to give good and impart good to others. That's the logical system in which we that we operate within and that we perceive. But it's not necessary. We can't say, like the Rambam explains in Mar Nevuchim and in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah at the beginning of his Mishnah Torah, there's nothing that we can say that is necessary to God, okay, the essence of God. It's only this sub-expression of God called the Ohr Ein Sof, which is already much, much higher than anything we can possibly comprehend. All we can say about it is that it's infinite light, which is sort of abstracting away from there's anything we can define here. Light is intangible. We know it's there, but we can't hold it. Right? The light beam comes into the room, and I try to grab the light beam that's coming through the window. I can see the light beam. I know that it's there. I know the room is bright instead of dark, but I can't grasp it. I can't hold it. Even to the extent that scientists physicists are able to talk about light. Light is a profound paradox that we can't even talk about. This is why we use the metaphor of light for what it is that we're describing and this expression of God. We don't know what we're talking about here. We just give it a name. But even the thing that we don't understand that we gave a name to is not the thing itself, is not God itself, and that's very important to appreciate. We're never touching when we talk about Hasidus, when we talk about Penimiyus HaTorah, when we're talking about trying to have a relationship with God. What we're trying to have and what we're trying to appreciate is a relationship or an understanding or a comprehension of our perception of God, of the way God decides to present God's self to us in a way that we can grasp. It's not the essence and the reality of what God really, really is. That is totally and completely beyond anything we can comprehend. Okay? And it's important to always keep that in mind as we move through this kind of material, not to think that we're touching on anything that is understandable or graspable about God itself. God is always beyond our wildest imagination. Okay, so in any case, so it arises at a certain point. It arises within God's unfathomable desire, so to speak, to create a world. And why does he want to create a world? He wants to create a world in order lahashpia metuvo leborov, in order to extend and express goodness to his creations. This idea of the purpose behind creation is fundamental within Penimiyus HaTorah, within Kabbalah. There is a purpose to creation, and the purpose to creation is that God is good, and goodness wants others to experience that goodness, because what's the best thing in the world is to give what I have to others, is to allow others to experience the ultimate goodness that I am experiencing. I want others to experience that. And that's why the world gets created. Because if there are no others, so to speak, there's no one to give that goodness to. Goodness remains only potential, but not actual. The ultimate goodness is to give goodness, and goodness could potentially be given, but it can't be actualized because there's no one to give it to. Okay, so I'm just going to jump down to the bottom on page Hey to the Levias Chein, where he has a long bunch of paragraphs. We're not going to read through all of it, but a long bunch of paragraphs developing this idea, because this understanding of why creation comes into existence is very, very important, foundational and fundamental to appreciate. Okay, so he says as follows. He says, Ha'inyan hazeh, this idea, kavar mavur b'sfarim kadmonim, is already explained in early svarim, in early books. Ayin b'sefer HaChinuch, for example, see the Sefer HaChinuch, which is an relatively early medieval book about the reasons for mitzvos. Shekasav, who writes, Mimidosav baruch hu shehu rav chesed v'hu chafetz b'tuvo briosav. One of the characteristics of God is that he is full of massive amounts of chesed, of kindness, of goodness, and desires the good of his creations. He desires us to experience goodness. There are many, many psukim, there are many verses throughout the Torah, throughout Tanakh, that we can use to prove and emphasize this idea. But ultimately, God wants us to experience goodness. God wants things to be good for us. God didn't create us to suffer and be miserable. God created us in order to experience goodness and positivity and pleasure and satisfaction and so on. And he wants us to be worthy of receiving that goodness. Ki lo yikra shalem betuva, because God, so to speak, can't be called holy and entirely good, rak mishu meitiv lachem zulaso, unless he is expressing that goodness to others. If I'm good and I have all the good in the world, but I keep it to myself, and I'm not wholly good, I'm good in a sense, but I'm also selfish. And so because of the wholeness of God's goodness, God desires, so to speak, to impart that goodness, to impart those blessings of God's goodness to us. And specifically, he desires for us to be worthy of receiving it. He wants us to earn it. This is a very, very important idea in Penimiyus HaTorah, that the whole idea is if God wants us, if God desires to impart goodness unto us, why does he have to create us? We're already experiencing the goodness even before creation. We're already part of that goodness before creation. Nothing comes into being that wasn't there before, right? There's nothing that exists outside of God. The Gemara tells us, Hu Mekomo Shel Olam, that God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the place within which everything else exists. On a certain level, we can say that everything, us and all of creation and all of history and so on and so forth, is just a figment of God's imagination, so to speak. It's all taking place within the mind of God, so to speak. Right? God doesn't have a mind, he doesn't have an imagination, but so to speak, this is all This is all the matrix being programmed by God in a certain sense. So if that's true, then why program the matrix and why make the matrix real in the first place, right? Why make any of this real in the first place? It was already real. It's already present and experiencing that goodness even before it was created. Right? If I'm just a figment of God's imagination, if I'm thought into existence, and the chair that I'm sitting on is thought into existence by God, and you are thought into existence by God, and the table is thought into existence by God, and apples and oranges are thought into existence by God, that means that apples, oranges, tables, chairs, me, and you were all present within the all-encompassing, totalizing reality of God's ratzon, of God's will and God's mind, even before it was created. There's no difference between pre-creation and post-creation. Ani Hashem lo shanisi, I am God, and nothing changes about me. Nothing changed from after creation to before creation. Or as we say in davening, Atahu misha barasa olam v'atahu achelu nivra olam v'atahu misha barasa olam. You are the one who was here before the world was created, and you, the exact same you, is here after the world was created. Nothing has actually changed. So if that's so, everything that's here now was already here before, just potentially within the mind and the will of God, without being actualized as sort of a separate creation. So if so, why create it in the first place? From the very beginning, I was already part and parcel of the divine. I was already fully experiencing the goodness of being part of that goodness. So why, in order to give that goodness, does creation have to happen? So the chinuch here, which he's quoting, alludes to this, which is developed in much greater depth by the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and others, many others, everybody who talks about this idea, that in order for me to fully experience goodness, I need to earn that goodness. What the Gemara, what the Talmud Yerushalmi describes as, when you give me a piece of bread for free, I can't look you in the eye afterwards because I'm a little bit ashamed. I'm a little bit ashamed that I got the bread for free. I'll eat the bread. I'm hungry. I'm going to eat the bread and I'm going to enjoy the bread. It tastes delicious, warm, and fresh. I'm going to enjoy it because it's good, and it's good for me. I'm happy that I have it, but nevertheless, I'm a little bit embarrassed. It takes away a little bit of how good that bread is, the fact that I didn't earn it for myself. I got it for free. It was a freebie. It was a handout. I'll take the handout. I need the handout. But it hurts a little bit to have to take a handout. I can experience things as fully good when you give me a paycheck, right? When I work hard and I've earned the money, you give me the check, and now it's not charity for which I have to be a little bit embarrassed about. Now it's my well-earned money and I can really enjoy it. So in order for God to fully express and give goodness to us, so to speak, in order for others, so to speak, to fully experience the totality of goodness without a twinge of shame or a twinge of the diminishment of that goodness because we haven't earned what we're receiving. So God has created a system in which we earn it, or it appears that we earn it, so to speak. It appears that we earn it. We never really earn it. Nothing we can possibly do can really justify and earn for us everything that we're receiving. I can do Torah and mitzvahs from today till tomorrow, and nothing can really justify and explain why I deserve to take a breath. But it's all chesed, it's all kindness. But from my limited perspective, sometimes I actually think I've earned it. I did good for you, so now you do good for me, and I've earned it. Now that I've earned it, I can sit back and enjoy it, and really enjoy it. And so now, through my ability to earn it, I actually succeed in fully experiencing that goodness. Because God desires to express and give goodness, God creates. Because the creation of things that experience themselves as outside or separate from the divine, rather than part and parcel of the divine, I experience myself as a separate being, and I can work for God. I can do things for God. I'm in control. I can do things if I'll choose to daven this morning, or I won't choose to daven this morning, as if I have the ability and the power to make that choice, and it's in my control. And if I choose to daven this morning, then I did good for you, and so now you do good for me. And when you do good for me, I enjoy it, and I can experience it as just payment and reward for the good I've done for you. I've earned it, and now I can really enjoy it. And this is all an illusion. This is all an illusion, of course, but it creates the possibility of me more fully experiencing that goodness so that God can really fulfill, so to speak, this imperative of wanting to do good for us and do the ultimate good for us, allow us to experience the ultimate goodness. Okay? Now, we can ask ourselves, well, what is this goodness, right? Is it hamburgers, right? Is it nice houses and good clothing? And what is the ultimate goodness that we're here to experience? What is it that God wants to give us that is the ultimate goodness? So the answer to this is very simple, which is if God is the ultimate good, then reconnecting, so to speak, after the traumatic separation of creation, reconnecting with the ultimate good, i.e., God, that becomes the ultimate experience of goodness. If I can connect to God, if I can experience God, if I can align myself with God, and I am now part and parcel of God and experience that as such, after I've already experienced myself as being separate from God because I'm a creation and He's the creator, that's the ultimate experience of goodness. Hamburgers are nice, and nice clothes are nice, and good houses are nice, and fast cars are nice, etc., etc. Those are all nice things, right? And they're good things, and I enjoy those things. But the ultimate good is for me to experience identity and alignment with goodness with a capital G, right? So connection with God becomes the ultimate good that I can experience, and I'm supposed to, and in order to experience that fully, I need to earn it rather than get it for free, right? So there's nothing quite like working really hard to be able to daven and pray well, and then having a fantastic davening after you work really hard at it. And now you sit back and you say, wow, I just had a connecting experience with the divine, and I did it, right? Sometimes I have flashes of inspiration where God just gives it to me as a freebie. That's not quite the same. But to think that I've earned it, that I worked hard at it and I've earned it, I've earned that experience of connection with God, that's a much, much more powerful thing. And that's the ultimate goodness. So he continues on this based on the Arizal. He says, "V'chein kasa maran harizal be'etz Chaim." Likewise, the Arizal Rav Yitzchak Luria writes in Eitz Chaim, "Kisha'Allah b'ratzono lahatzil hanatzal v'livra nivraim." When it arose in God's will to express the expressions of the divine and to create creations, l'siba nodas, for the known reason, v'hu likare rachum b'chanun ukiyotze, so that God could be called merciful and kind and father and judge and king, etc., etc. And if there's no one in the world to receive God's mercy, then how can God be called merciful? And likewise for all the other titles and names that we use for God. If there's no one out there to experience God as judge, then God can't be judge. Judge makes no sense. There's no such concept. All of these things are potentially what God is, and they are what God is, because God is fully and totally all-encompassing. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu encompasses everything. He is the Ein Sof by definition. So He is a father, and He is a judge, and He is a king, and He is compassionate, and He does get angry. So again, so to speak, right? We're applying human terminology to the divine. It's not literal, but from our experience, right? He is all of these things. But He can't be all these things if there's no such thing as anger, and there's no such thing as mercy, and there's no such thing as judgment and justice, and there's no such thing as kindness, and there's no such thing as parents, and there's no such thing as children, and there's no such thing as shepherds and sheep, and on and on. None of these ways of referring or relating to God could have any traction. They don't attach to anything unless there's a creation, unless there's something created. Now that there's a creation, so now there's a thing in the world called sheep. And sheep have shepherds. And now that there are sheep and there are shepherds, now I can appreciate God as shepherd and me as sheep, or us as sheep. And because there are parents and there are children and they have relationships with each other, and I know what it's like to have a father and I know what it's like to have children, so now there can be an appreciation or a recognition of God, of me experiencing God as father, or as king, or as a judge, or as merciful or as compassionate, as equitable and patient, and all of these things. None of those things make any sense. They can't have any traction, any reality, unless there's a creation, unless there are other people to recognize it. Basic principle within Penimiyus HaTorah in Kabbalah is Ein Melech Belo Am. There's no king without a nation, meaning God is all of these things, but it doesn't mean anything if no one is recognizing God as being all of these things. Perception makes reality. Our perception constitutes that reality. If the tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, Kabbalah says it made no sound. Right? The sound is irrelevant. If God exists and no one's around to appreciate that there's a God, so there's something missing, so to speak, from God's existence. Because part of God's existence is all-encompassing, king, judge, father, merciful, kind, compassionate, on and on, but no one sees those things. They're not perceived, and if they're not perceived, then God is not being revealed as such. And if I'm not being revealed as such, then I'm not. In an abstract sense, I might be, but not in a real sense. Not in a real sense. And so all of these creation comes into being so that these things can be seen. When these things are seen, I connect to them, right? I connect to God as judge when I experience God's judgment. I experience God's judgment. I recognize God as judge or as merciful, or as parent, or as shepherd, or as king, or whatever it happens to be. And I connect to the divine through that appreciation and recognition and the way in which God is being revealed to me within my own experience and my own perception. So God becomes more fully whole, so to speak. Not God itself, but the Ohr Ein Sof becomes more fully whole. The Ohr Ein Sof that is trying to express its Ohr Ein Sofius, its infinitude, it can be expressed only through there being creation. Creation to recognize it, creation to receive it, and through receiving it also connect back to it, and thereby achieve and encounter and experience the ultimate goodness. Okay. So if creation is here in order for, so God at a certain point, God, the Ohr Ein Sof, right, the expression of God, the system called Ohr Ein Sof, which has all of these fundamental postulates within it, that system at a certain point decides, okay, you know what, there's something missing. There's something missing here. I'm not seen for what I really am. I'm not seen for the totality of who I am. I'm not seen as anything. And I can't fulfill, so to speak, I can't fulfill my goodness. I can't actualize my goodness because there's no one experiencing good from me. And so I'm going to create other creations that experience themselves as separate from me, so that that separated experience can now be can be elevated into an experience of connection from within separation. And after you felt detached, and now you experience attachment again. So now you're experiencing the ultimate goodness. You're encountering the thing that is now defined. I'm encountering God as all of these different names and all of these different titles and as all of these different characteristics. And so now I'm fully experiencing God, and not because I'm part of God, but because I actually experience myself as separate from God, as a creation relating to a creator. But now I'm connected to that creator. And that's very, very powerful. That's the ultimate goodness, to allow others to have that experience of not being part of God and being able to connect and be aligned with God through their own hard work. That's the ultimate goodness that God could give over to us. And so that kickstarts the entire process of creation. But it can't start until something happens. Why? Because there is no space for creation to exist. Because there's an Ohr Ein Sof, because there's this infinite light, this infinite expression of God, all of reality is defined by and encompassed within this infinite light, and now there's no space for creation. What in the world does that mean? What does it mean that there's no space for creation because everything is full of the infinite light of God, of the Ohr Ein Sof? So to explain that, we have to appreciate a little bit about what the Ohr Ein Sof really is and what it means. What are we talking about when we talk about Ohr? right? All of these things are mishalim. These are all metaphors for something else. Kabbalah is all speaking in metaphors. We have to be very, very careful to always appreciate that the things we're talking about here, we talk about light, we talk about darkness, we talk about infinity and finitude, and we're going to talk about empty spaces, and we're going to talk about pipelines of light, and then we're even going to, at a certain point, we're going to talk about body parts of different worlds and weird stuff. We have to appreciate the entire time that every time we use any terminology, from whether it's very spiritual terminology or very physical terminology, we're talking in metaphor, and we're describing things that are not actual these things. So when we say that before creation there's just infinite light, this is not true, really, because there is no light. Light begins after Bereshis. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, and then God says, "Vayihi ar," there should be light, and now there's light. Right? So prior to creation, there's no such thing as light, but we use the word light to describe what was there, in part because light gives us the best relatable metaphor to try and grasp what it is that we're talking about. So what is it that we're talking about when we speak about Ohr Ein Sof, the infinite light, the infinite expression of God? What we're talking about is the degree to which God's reality is expressed and manifest and revealed. Ohr Ein Sof means the infinite revelation of the totality and essence of God to the extent that it can be expressed, right? Again, we're not talking about God itself, but the Ohr Ein Sof is the highest, most all-encompassing, most clear, manifest, unadulterated, unrefracted expression and revelation of what God really is. Okay? We can understand then that in a space, in a consciousness, in an awareness of the reality of God's infinitude and all-encompassing unity, it's impossible for anything else to exist within that space. As the book here writes, within that space, this infinite light destroys and annihilates and burns up anything else within it. Not literally. Okay, it's not a giant laser beam that it's not the Death Star that destroys everything in its path. Right? That's not what we're talking about here. And what we're talking about is that this infinite light is an ultimate, powerful, all-encompassing, unlimited revelation of the essence of what God really is, and that is everything. God, what is God? Everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everything. If that's so, then this is true. Nothing can exist within the space in which only everything exists. All right, what do I mean by that? Well, on a very, very low level, or on a very, very practical, our worldly level, right? I'm sitting on a chair at a table. I have a pile of books in front of me. My watch is on the table next to me on one side. There's a pen on the table next to me on the other side. None of these things can exist. Why? Because each of these things has a definition. The chair is not a table. This book is not that book. The watch is not a pen. And as the watch ticks off time, this second is not the next second, is not the next second. The blue paint on the wall is not the same as the white paint on the ceiling. These are different. However, the true reality of God is that none of these things are different. They're all just God, because God is everything. They're all just expressions of godliness. There is no difference between table and chair and apple and orange and pen and watch and this book and that book and wall and ceiling and me and you. None of these things exist as differentiated beings, because all of that difference is just an illusion. From God's perspective, with a full appreciation, with a full awareness and consciousness that God is everything, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is all-encompassing, Ohr Ein Sof, infinite expression of God's reality, infinite revelation of what God, the unity of what God really is, everything else disappears as a unique and distinct being. There are no distinct beings. whether we're talking about tables and chairs, or as he says over here, whether we're talking about different kinds of angels, which are very, very spiritual things, right? We're not talking about physical things, but spiritual things also disappear because spiritual things also have definition. Spiritual things also have definition, and those things also they have definition, they have limitations. This angel is not that angel. This spiritual reality is different from that spirituality. None of these things can exist as realities in and of themselves, in a space in which there is a full and complete and total revelation of the essence of what God really is, which is the all-encompassing, totalizing reality of everything. Then no individual thing can exist. There's no space for it. There's no possibility of it. You can't have a chair because the chair is no different from the table, and the apple is no different from the orange, and I am no different from you, because we're all just expressions of godliness, and God is undifferentiated and indivisible. So the divine will, from a true perspective, can't be divided into tables and chairs, and me's and you's, and my soul and your soul, and this angel and that angel, and do's and don'ts even, mitzvos and averos. The Kabbalists talk about how on very, very high levels of abstract reality with total revelation of God, there's no difference even between sins and mitzvos and averos, right? Because they both exist as consequences of the divine will. From our perspective, as a result of commandments that we have received, there's a difference between eating a piece of kosher beef and a piece of pork. There's a difference from our perspective. From God's perspective, those are just different, necessary, appropriate, willed expressions of the divine will, and there's no difference between them. They have no definition. They're all just light. They're all just revelation of godliness in no different ways. Right? Again, from our perspective, they're very, very different. Right? The truth is that this idea is some of the most dangerous uses of Kabbalah and Penimiyus HaTorah result from this idea that nothing matters. Right? There's no difference between anything. There's no difference between the pork and the kosher beef. Right? There's no difference from God's perspective. So when I exist on a very high Kabbalistic level, the pork and the beef are the same. And there have been, people like Shabtai Tzvi in particular, but other offshoots of Sabbateanism, which is one of the most well-known misuses of Kabbalah that have been out there. It was false messianism, but there was many other things wrapped up in it. This was sort of the stuff that was wrapped up in it. The idea that in order to reach very high levels of appreciation of God, the laws of the Torah have to be intentionally broken to sort of bring us to a higher reality where there's no difference between following the law and breaking the law, because now we're at that place. We should never go there, and we can't go there because we live in this world and we live as commanded beings, experiencing ourselves as creations who are subject to command, and so on and so forth. But we should note that the reason why at a very high level, at the level of Ohr Ein Sof, nothing else can exist is because everything exists in an undifferentiated way within the ultimate unity of God. And so there's a necessity that arises, as he says over here. There's a necessity that arises to create space, so to speak, to create space for creation. What do we mean by space? We'll talk about this in the next shiur, but what we mean by space is a necessary refraction or a limiting of the degree to which the reality of God is clear. There has to be a diminution of the clarity and revelation of the essence and unity and all-encompassing infinity of the divine. Once God starts pulling that back and diminishing the extent to which there's an appreciation and an awareness and a consciousness of the ultimate unity and connectivity and divine reality of everything. So now there's a possibility for things to take form, for things to exist. Right? Once we reduce the extent to which I appreciate that everything is just God, Now I can appreciate that there are other things, so to speak. Right. So at the very from let's say God and angels. God and right, long before there's people, long before there's tables, chairs, and apples and oranges. God and angels, right? How do angels come into being? Angels can only come into being if there's a reduction in the awareness that everything is God. If I reduce that awareness, that creates space, that creates makom, that creates the possibility to appreciate things other than God. At that very high level, the only things other than God that could possibly exist are very spiritual, unphysical things. But nevertheless, then I can appreciate them as differentiated from the divine, so to speak. They're not actually. It's all a result of this like fake out of I'm going to make it look like there are things that are other than me, so that you can appreciate anything, and that not every right that so that this whole process of creation and receiving goodness and appreciating the essence of God and connecting to that from a place of disconnection can happen. But I'm creating, God says, I'm creating that disconnection. I'm creating that impression of disconnection, all so that you can now begin to appreciate the possibility of other things other than me. And what gets put into this space, this empty space, he describes what gets put into this empty space. He creates empty space. Al-kain hutzrach lasos makom panui. Therefore, God necessarily, so to speak, had to create empty space b'chtei livro shama holamos, in order to create in that space worlds. In order to create within that space worlds. We'll have a long chapter on this much later in the book on the idea of olamos, on worlds. Olam literally means world. But the truth is that we're not talking about different places. I'm not talking about Earth and Pluto. I'm not talking about other galaxies. I'm not talking about other places when we talk about other worlds. I'm not even talking about other dimensions. When we talk about olam, what we're talking about, when we talk about different olamos that exist within creation and that exist within this space that God creates for creation to exist within, we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about levels of awareness. That's what an olam is. Olam, the word olam, which we usually translate as world or universe, it actually comes from the word helem. Helem means hidden or hidden, something that's hidden, meaning the olamos are levels of hiddenness of God's presence. We have 5 olamos, which we'll talk about within creation. There are 5, at least the Arizal talks about 5 olamos. Later, Mikubalim, other Mikubalim talk about many, many, many other olamos that exist as well. But there are infinite levels of consciousness and awareness of God's presence. But on a basic level, we can talk about 5 levels of awareness, 5 levels of consciousness, 5 olamos, which are 5 degrees of hiddenness of God's reality. And so we could start from the very beginning, at the very top, so to speak. There's a level at which God is barely hidden, a little bit hidden. God's all-encompassing presence is reduced by a tiny bit. And then below that, God's presence is God's revelation, the revelation of God's reality, of God's all-encompassing essence and unity is reduced even more. And even more at a 3rd level, and even more on a 4th level, and even more on a 5th level, until finally we get to our reality in which God's presence is pretty hidden. It's hidden enough so that I can see tables and chairs and apples and oranges and me and you, and actually experiencing those things as differentiated from each other and as not part and parcel of God itself, unless I actively choose to see it that way. So within this space, within this empty space, so to speak, meaning within this void, and we'll talk more about this empty space and how it's created next time, but within this empty space, what we have is the possibility now for experiencing levels of consciousness, levels of awareness, where I'm less aware of the reality that molekular kavodo, that everything is all God. God is everything, everything is God. There is no difference between the all-encompassing Ohr Ein Sof that defines and delimits and encompasses all reality and the world that I experience. It's all the same thing. But because of levels upon levels upon levels of refraction and distortion and hiddenness, I don't actually normally experience it that way. And I have to work at experiencing that way. I have to work at seeing God within all of these things. I go outside and I see a leaf. I have to work at seeing God within that leaf, God's presence, God's will expressing itself as that leaf. I have to work at seeing and feeling and experiencing God's presence in the chair that I'm sitting on, at the table I'm sitting at, in the book that I'm reading, and the book that I'm not reading, and the apple and the orange, and me and in you, and so on and so forth. I have to work at it. And because I have to work at it, once I experience it, now I've earned the experience, the amazing positive affect, the spiritual affect, the enjoyable experience of finally going, aha, the light bulb goes on. I see it. I see it now. I see God here and I see God there and I see God's presence here and there. And I know what I'm looking at and I'm connecting these things to different aspects of God through the different names and different titles and different ways of relating to the divine. I'm actually seeing it now. I didn't see it a second ago, but now I see it. And that switch from a second ago, I didn't see it. All I saw was a cup of cold water, and now I see it and experience it. And that is the ultimate goodness that a person can possibly experience. Number one, because I'm connecting with the divinity within everything and within myself. That's number one. Number two, and so I'm literally aligning myself and connecting myself and putting myself, attaching myself to goodness. So I'm experiencing goodness. And number two, I'm experiencing it as a result, not because that's what I naturally see, then it's unearned. But I'm seeing it and I'm experiencing it because I worked to see and I worked at it. I trained myself to walk outside and take a deep breath of the air and smell the pollen or smell feel the sun on my face and experience something more than just sun. I experience an expression of divinity. I experience God's Ratzon, the divine will, expressing itself as sun, as a tree, as a cloud, as a traffic jam, as a steak, or whatever else it happens to be. Now that's a very powerful experience of goodness, and that's how we fulfill. That's how we fulfill the ultimate purpose of creation, which all began and which all kicked off on as He started. It all kicked off with God wanting to give that goodness over to us, to give us the experience of His goodness. And we experience that specifically because He created a space in which He's hidden. And by Him being hidden, I can rediscover Him. And when I rediscover Him, now I experience goodness through my own hard work, or at least my perception of my own hard work. And that then allows me to experience that goodness without anything missing from it. Okay, fine. So I think that's a good place to stop. Or that is a good place to stop. So we'll stop here, and God willing, so the shir is going to continue Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock Central Time. The same Zoom link. We'll continue to use the same Zoom link, but I'm going to post the recordings as well. So again, I thank you all for indulging me for tonight, so that I could at least try to get a recording of the first share. Yeah, okay, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good night.